Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Olivia Worley. Olivia is an author born and raised in New Orleans. A graduate of Northwestern University, she now lives in New York City, where she spends her time writing thrillers, overanalyzing episodes of The Bachelor, and hoping someone will romanticize her for reading on the subway. She is the author of People to Follow and The Debutantes. Welcome, Olivia.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. I her book is So Happy Together, which I love. If you're listening to us and not watching, you got to go check out this cover because it's all those fun little edible Valentine's hearts, and one of them is cracked into a bunch of little pieces, which is very appropriate. Before we dig into all the fun stuff about So Happy Together, will you tell us a little bit about your book?
So Happy Together is a psychological thriller that follows a 24-year-old playwright named Jane living in New York City. And she, on a dating app, meets Colin, who is a sweet, lovable software engineer who she is certain is the love of her life. Everything is going perfectly until he breaks things off after 6 dates and then gets a new girlfriend named Zoe. But Jane is determined to win him back. She's certain this is just a stumbling block. So Jane begins to take matters into her own hands and eventually breaks into Colin's apartment where she makes a shocking discovery that will ensnare both Jane, Colin, and his new girlfriend Zoe in a complicated web of lies, secrets, and murder. So everything spirals from there.
It's so fun. So this is your first adult thriller. We were just talking about how you have
Yes.
this is your third book, but the first two books are
Mhm.
YA. And so tell us, like, what was the transition like? Did you do it on purpose? Were you like, I have a story that, I mean, this is not a YA story, obviously. So,
Right.
so what prompted that?
Yeah, so I usually like to say when I started writing YA, I was kind of the same age as a YA character. I had been writing books since I was like in my early teens, but my first one to be published, People to Follow, came out when I was 25, so I was like 23 when I wrote it. So at a certain point, as much as I love YA and will continue to write YA, I started to feel like I wanted to write about my own experience as someone like in my 20s in New York City and figuring out life post grad and what that looks like and all of the fun, delicious, really dark things that you can do with adult too. So that is, I think, mainly where the transition came from.
And so, when you were coming upon the story, because it is really, what I love about this book is it is sort of the really deep insight into sort of the crazy that happens when we fall
Mhm.
for somebody, which I think unfortunately is not age resistant. You don't get to be a
Right.
certain age where you like outgrow the crazy. And sort of how that, especially when you're living in a city like New York, which, I know you're doing right now, and I have spent a month there, here and there, and it is a very, like, people talk about the sort of the difficulty of dating in New York, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a billion people, connecting with that one person, and now the apps and all these sort of complications.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, was there like a really bad date that Olivia had that she's like,
Yeah.
now I'm gonna
It
kill someone?
There wasn't one particular date that inspired this book, but it definitely is inspired by like 3 years of experience on the dating apps in New York City, and particularly like this one situation that kept kind of happening to me like a couple times was on the dating apps. I would find it very hard to meet someone who I actually connected with because I think you're set up really like to fail a little bit when it's so picture oriented and this weird like synthetic almost situation for meeting someone. And what would happen to me a couple times is I would meet someone who I was really excited about, which was a very rare feeling for me, and I'd let myself start to get excited, and then about 5 or 6 dates in, they would say, I'm actually not over my ex or I'm not looking for anything serious. And that honestly was more devastating to me sometimes than like an actual breakup of a long-term relationship because you're grieving like the potential of this person that you don't really even know. So actually, there was a pretty dark time in my years on the dating apps in New York where one of these types of situations had just happened to me, and I was feeling really down about it. Like, it's all over. I'm never going to meet someone if I can't meet them here in this big giant city. And I literally like I got on TikTok, which I'm want to do, I guess, and started getting served these like spiritual like tarot manifestation TikToks, which for anyone who's not on TikTok is very much a thing. It'll be these women with like a tarot deck and they pull out a random card and they're like a divine masculine energy will be returning to your life if you only claim it, and just it gets into this weird idea that you can like manifest someone back into your life and kind of control your environment and the world around you by the power of your own thoughts, which is a really easy like wormhole to fall into when you're feeling really down. And I realized after I had kind of crawled myself out of this hole of like being really unwell, I realized that this was great fodder for like a thriller. Just this sense that like you can become so attached to someone that you don't even know, especially in the era of social media. And then on sites like TikTok and other social media, you're getting this information that's like, well, yeah, it's all in your control. If you just want to win them back, you have to make it happen with like the power of your own thoughts, which is so creepy and part of how So Happy Together was inspired.
I love that. It's funny because the thing about those algorithms, I mean, first of all, I'm kind of a woo-woo believer. So a
Mhm.
manifestation in lots of ways, I think, is like how we manifest our careers and how we manifest our
No,
career.
yeah, totally with my career. I'm like a
Right.
little bit still bought
Right.
into it.
But like if you're talking about like right, manifesting one man who
hmm
throw things off to come back to you, that yeah, maybe I mean I don't know, maybe somebody can do that, but that seems but the algorithm really does like it's almost like it just it's smart and if if you sort of like one thing that's about like
hmm
being devastated or heartbroken because I went through a divorce here like 3 years ago and all of a sudden my entire feed is about women post-divorce empowerment and all and like finding like meeting another man or never meeting whatever it is like just all the time and it really
hmm
does get into your head. You're like, wow, okay. And then all of a sudden it seems like that's all there is. Like everybody
Yeah.
must be doing this because it's the only thing I see. Um,
Yeah. No, it's very easy to get into that feedback loop that's just yourself.
well, and it's funny is when the book started, I really thought, okay, this is going to be, this is really going to be about her, you know, getting this man back, and I mean Jane getting Colin back. But really what develops and Zoe becomes this sort of really unexpected
Mhm.
character and the friendship that develops between them. Of course, Zoe doesn't know everything about what's going on in Jane's mind because Jane is trying to steal her boyfriend. But it's this kind of amazing and I love the sort of what where that story goes and how those two and we don't do spoilers so we you have to
Mhm.
read it because but it is so fascinating and I wondered is that sort of how you start like did you know that was where the book was going when you started or did that and how do you write are you a I got this sort of planned out and we'll see how it goes I have every serious outlines or sort of as you go what works for you.
Yeah, so I am an outliner and usually I'm like a concept first writer. I'm very much the type who's like, oh, I want to do this meets this or this
Oh,
location or this sort of high concept thing. So with So Happy Together, it started from basically my own experiences on the dating apps and being like, okay, what if this situation happened to someone who, instead of being like a relatively normal and well-adjusted person like myself, was someone more like Joe Goldberg from You. And that's where the germ of the idea came from. But yeah, I think as I was writing it and working through my own feelings of like frustration with dating culture and loneliness and anxiety, like living in a big city like New York, I I sort of found that relationship with Jane and Zoe as well, which is interesting because it becomes this thing where like this budding friendship between Jane and Zoe, even though it begins under false pretenses of Jane trying to stay closer to Colin, it eventually becomes this other like really important relationship to Jane because besides being, single, she doesn't really have many friends. She's a very like isolated, lonely person. So it became this really fun balance to play with of you have this like sort of delusional, like romantically obsessed person who then finds a friendship that also like gets at this lonely part of her looking for connection and which of these two relationships is she going to choose in the end because like it's all going to spiral and it's not
Yeah,
going to
she
end
can't have
happily.
both, right? Exactly. Well, and then there's this also this truth piece about Hamlet, and I wanted you to talk about
Yeah.
that too, because particularly the character of Ophelia, who is
Mhm.
this, this symbol. So talk, yeah, I'm curious if that was, if there's that was sort of part of the inspiration, or if that developed, and how you see, Ophelia in the modern day, because it is, obviously she's a very old character.
Yeah. So I am a recovering theater kid. I, like Jane, went to college for theater, but I was there for actually musical theater performance instead of playwriting. So I always have been kind of fascinated with Hamlet and Ophelia specifically as this character where she's kind of like this mystery where she's like in love with Hamlet and then like a bunch of really bad things happen and then suddenly she has this like psychotic break a little bit and like she's mad and then she dies. So I felt like there's always like so much more there than we're often taught because usually like when you're reading Hamlet in school or whatever, we're focused on Hamlet, who is also like a mad character, but a much bigger part of that play. So I actually in college, like Jane in the book, wrote an adaptation of Hamlet that was about Ophelia.
Okay.
Um, it is out there somewhere on the internet. It was produced as an audio play because it was during COVID. So when I started to write this character of Jane, who is a playwright, I like kind of just started to pull some stuff from my own work when I was like around her age. So that is where that came from. But I do think like this idea of like the mad woman, who's driven mad, we're led to believe by like the men in her life or the lack of like support and attention from the men in her life is really interesting because Jane and Zoe at one point in the book have this conversation about like, was Ophelia really mad, or is her madness sort of like her own way of finding freedom in a really restrictive situation? Because, like, and that's kind of the thing with a lot of the mad characters in Shakespeare is like now you can say what's really on your mind and no one is stopping you. So, yeah, I'm like rambling a little bit. I could talk
Oh,
about
I love that. I mean,
Ophelia for forever, but
I know.
that's all of that was in there.
I mean, I love that you put that in there, and I also like it. I mean, I really, as the name of the podcast implies, I'm always
Mhm.
super interested in the women characters, and obviously, there's no men haters, but it is just to me the sort of, and I think there's something about the women being, it's like the Thelma and Louise, right? Like the only way
Mhm.
that book could end was for both women to die. Like that is, there's for, centuries, it turns out, there's this culture of, women, the idea that women can't survive without men, they can't survive without male attention,
Mhm.
that not having that stability of a solid relationship and marriage or whatever, not being cared for by men makes them crazy. And I think so many women are exploring that in so many sort of exciting and new ways. And I think that is what we see with, and not just Jane's screenplay, but also Zoe's art, right? So they have
Mhm.
this weird symbiosis because they're both sort of Ophelia, um, focused, or they
Mhm.
both have these deep interests in Ophelia. And I also loved what you did. There's a whole scene at the end where there's this art show, which is, which
Mhm.
also is, where they do a little bit of Jane's play, to an audience. And I'm curious about the art because, you did a really, I mean, it's really cool to see, to imagine Zoe's art. And I wondered if, if was that for you, what was the visual process of creating an artist like?
Yeah, so that was also interesting because I am not at all a visual artist. I have no expertise in that area. And I honestly like I don't know that I really did that much research until after I was writing Zoe as an artist. I think I found this idea fascinating that these two characters would both be really fascinated by Ophelia and like kind of what that could look like in two different mediums. Yeah, so I don't know. I did like at some point I was looking up like reference photos of like, women in bathtubs, like with their face kind of submerged in flowers, and this sort of like the famous I think it's John Everett Millay, the Ophelia painting, that is pretty famous, where it's both this like romanticization of
Yeah.
like, if that's the word, of like a drowning woman and also
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
women artists like kind of reclaiming that. I thought was an interesting thing to play with.
So when you started writing about, Zoe and Jane, what did you sort of know that Zoe was an artist and Jane was a screen? Had you sort of imagined how that their lives would intersect this way?
Yeah, I think definitely. And also there's the added layer of like Jane is very much an aspiring playwright. Like it's what she went to school for, but right now she's like editing college application essays, which is similar to what I did when I first moved here. I was a test prep tutor. And Zoe, on the other hand, seems to be like making a living off of like this TikTok stuff she does, but also her art. Um, so I think there's a lot of just like that is part of what I was experiencing when I first moved here. Like, how do you start to make a life and a career in the creative industry that you love? And like, what is it like when someone your age is much more advanced in that than you are? So I think it was like an added thing for Jane to kind of obsess about with Zoe.
Yeah. Yeah, there is. I mean, I think women in general, there's this interesting, like, sort of, there's this notion that we know we should be supporting one another, right? That the sort of
Mhm.
rising tide lifts all boats kind of experience. But there is this also there, I think, society, culture, whatever it is, has also sort of puts us in a position to always sort of compare ourselves to women
Mhm.
around us. And so it's, like you said, not only is Jane trying to get Colin back, now she's sort of facing a foe with Zoe, who seems like
Mhm.
a pretty, you know, successful and I mean, in some ways, the tide turns a little bit about her focus is also in proving to Jane proving to Zoe
Mhm.
that she is, worthy of her own success. So she's fighting her
Mhm.
own, and like you said, it's so much about the age and the environment.
Mhm.
And I think both of these women also their lives are quite, they're pretty reclusive. Being an artist in New York,
Mhm.
and you know this, right? I mean, if
Yeah.
you're not going to an office, and you're not like seeing other people all the time, then you are in your own head an awful
Mhm.
lot.
Yeah, I feel like I often will. Last night I was at trivia and my friend was like, "How are you?" And I was like, "You are the first real person I've talked to today, so I'm
Yeah.
excited to be here."
Yeah,
Um,
right?
yeah, totally.
Yeah, that is so true. So did you go to school in the New York area?
No, I was at Northwestern just outside
Oh
of
yeah,
Chicago.
that's right. I actually read that out loud.
Yes,
Somehow
no.
I didn't process it, but I got it. Okay, so what brought you to New York from New Orleans to Chicago to New York City?
Yeah, so I had always planned to move here after graduation because I was going to do like the acting thing, just like move here and start auditioning. But I graduated in 2020, like right at the start of the pandemic. So there was a bit of a gap where I went home and I was like working retail. And actually, that was when I sort of rediscovered writing and started thinking about seriously getting published. But yeah, I moved to New York in the summer of 2021, I think, to do a summer publishing program at NYU. Because for
Yeah,
a minute, I was like, maybe I'll work in publishing. Um, and then through that program, I was like, I think I just want to write.
yeah,
I think that's my path. But yeah, I love it here. I had always wanted to live here, and I was worried that I wouldn't like it as much when I'm not like pursuing acting so much. But I think this is the perfect city to be a writer.
oh yeah,
Um, and the perfect city to be an introvert also because it's easy to be surrounded by people, but still kind of like you can be alone without being alone, which
Yeah.
is both a wonderful thing, but also like in this book for a character like Jane can be really dangerous because it's easy to self-isolate.
Yes.
Um, but also a perfect city to be a writer because every day I go outside and see the weirdest thing I've ever seen.
Yes. Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I think that's right. Well, I mean, it is interesting. So it's like, when you're when you're an introvert, and I think one of the things, the world is sort of set up against introverts in my mind,
mhm,
right? There's the whole sort of idea that when you meet somebody, you have to just project this like, personality and this like energy and, versus like really it'd be much nicer for introverts, and I'm an introvert as well, to like go through the process of like writing letters back and forth for like
mhm.
6 months before you meet in person. So,
Yeah.
so tell us about, what you're working on next. Are you working on, are you going to write both? Are you going to alternate? How will this work?
Yeah, so up next for me after So Happy Together is my next young adult thriller. It's like a slasher film set that turns into a real life slasher book called Final Cut, and that comes out in October. And then next summer, I don't have a release date yet, but my next adult thriller will be coming out, and I'll hopefully get to say more about that one soon. I'm doing edits right now,
That's
and
so
I'm really
exciting.
excited about that too.
So you're
Yeah.
writing 2 books a year. So tell me, like, you're like head into the adult book, and then, I mean, obviously I know the way this works is that you might be in the middle of writing something when you get, edits or copy edits, or
Mhm.
so you have to, go back and forth. But are you writing one at a time? Is that the goal?
So what's nice with my situation is currently I actually have the same editor for both my young adult and adult, because it's two different imprints, but under the same like umbrella of at Macmillan. So it's nice because if
Ah.
I'm overworked, she's also overworked. Which does happen sometimes, but like things kind of balance out a little bit more where I'm never like on two really tight deadlines at the same time.
And it sounds like they're giving you some like sort of every 6 months ish. So you
Mhm.
have that sort of there's no like time off really, but at least you're not, they're not coming out sort of back to back. That's unusual actually. Everybody we were talking before we started airing about a couple other authors who have been in YA and are now doing sort of adult debut thrillers, and yeah, most of them have two publishers.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's definitely a unique situation that has worked well for
Ah,
me so
yeah.
far.
Yeah. Not whatever you
Yeah,
do.
no.
That's super exciting. So tell us a little bit about, so you published your first book young. It sounds like, I mean, you would have been, how old were you when it came?
I think I was 25 when it came out.
Yeah, so you're a baby, which is super exciting. So you went home, and working some
Mhm.
odd jobs, and then started to write. And what was the process like? Did you publish the first book you wrote?
It was technically the second book that I wrote, but the first that I had ever like queried literary agents with. I was originally during the pandemic writing a completely different book that would actually later be retooled into my book, The Debutantes, that came out next. But originally I was working on that book. I'm very glad that that was not the version that I tried to query. Because essentially what happened was I submitted to this mentorship program called Author Mentor Match that is no longer around. But basically, like you could submit your manuscript to a selection of mentors who are other authors or like queried writers in the or agented writers in the industry, and hopefully get picked by one of them to like work together and develop your manuscript and eventually
What
get a
a
literary
great,
agent.
yeah, what a great experience.
Um, yeah, so I submitted to that with the other book that will never see the light of day, and my wonderful mentor Alexa Dunn, who is another YA author, wanted to mentor me, but she was like, "What other ideas do you have?" So I kind of threw out this influencer and then there were none murder mystery idea that I had, and she was like, "Write that, write that one first." So that became People to Follow.
That's amazing. So I think I mean, we get a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of aspiring authors who listen to
Mhm,
the podcast, and, we get a lot of questions about sort of how do you find your way through that first
mhm.
novel, the first drafts, the querying process. And that sounds like it's unfortunate it's defunct because it does seem
Yeah.
like that there it would be nice if there were ways to sort of have somebody sort of that idea of having somebody. I know International Thriller Writers does some of those sort of mentoring programs and those kinds of things are great. But anyway, that it sounds like that was fantastic. And again, congratulations because the fact that you sounds like the first book you really wrote all the way through and went became published, which I'm sure and people have told you is very, very,
Yes.
very rare. Okay.
Yeah, totally.
So obviously aside from the fact that the pandemic happened, did you feel like you sort of got to the point where you're like, are you happy that you're not acting? Did you feel like you
Mhm.
sort of sort of saved by the
Yeah, I think very much. Yeah, and I don't want to be like, oh, this is the bright spot of the
Of
pandemic
course
because I
not.
know
Right.
it's a
There's no
really
bright
bad
spot. We
time.
know. Yeah.
But yeah, I think I probably always would have ended up on this path. I think just the way that I am wired, I was not going to do well with like the audition grind of living in New York. So I'm in some ways grateful that the situation of the pandemic brought me to this sooner. I do like I miss acting a little bit sometimes, but like I very much don't miss the self-taping and like the auditions and just all of that. So like weirdly, I jumped from one career that is very unstable to another, but this one I was like, oh, this you can there's like a set process for how to get an agent that is so much better than acting, where it's like no one knows how to get an agent because they have to kind of just find you. So
Yeah.
um
Right. Right.
yeah,
And
so I'm
I
very
mean,
happy.
and it does feel like, especially as an introvert, the process of being a published author at least feels it's definitely not. I would never suggest this is like a super stable career, but at least it seems more stable than acting, right? And once you have an agent, I do feel like you have sort of a partner in it, and maybe that's the
Mhm.
same for screen agents. I sort of, I guess I've watched too much television about,
Mhm.
I think I know, which I do. I know nothing about that. But also you're in New York, so if you wanted to act, I'm sure you could like find
Mhm.
a club or a class
Yeah.
or whatever. And I love that you do trivia. I know that's, I mean, but that's like my son is a 23-year-old in New York City, and say like the
Mhm.
things he does, like the things he does are, I mean, it's what you have to do because I think otherwise, like you
Mhm.
said, you could be in your apartment 24/7, which it looks
Yes.
lovely, but I'm sure it
Thank
would be
you.
a little bit lonely.
Yeah, it's very nice to have reasons to go outside
Totally,
every now
totally.
and again.
Yeah. Well, this is so exciting. I'll be so curious to hear what you come up with next for your adult thriller. It sounds like we'll get to hear more about it. Tell our listeners where to find you because I know you're on
Mhm.
social media and it sounds like you're on TikTok.
Yes, I'm kind of against my will, but I've learned to love it. I'm mostly on Instagram and TikTok. Both of those places, I think I'm Olivia.Worley, but also if you look up my name, an author, it probably comes up. Yeah, and So Happy Together comes out on June 3rd.
That's so
So I
exciting.
guess it's probably out now and this will be airing.
Yeah, this airs. That's a really good question. I always have to look. So this today is June 5th when you're listening to this, which means
Mhm.
So Happy Together is out in the world and you can grab your copy. And I'll be so curious to hear what people think about Zoe and Jane.
Yes, me too.
Such a fun read. And Colin, for that matter too.
Yes.
So we will again, you have to read the book. It's a fabulous cover. I love this bright pink. I hope you're working on your ensembles to match your cover. I always feel like
Yeah, I need to. I'm researching.
that's like my favorite part. I know it shouldn't be my favorite
hmm
part, but when the cover comes, I'm always like, okay, what can I wear to match that? But this gives you, there's lots of fun colors in here, so you will find. And actually, I wore blue because I was like, well, I'm picking up a little. This,
Perfect. Yeah, the light blue.
the strange things we obsess about.
hmm
So fun to have you today, Olivia.
Yeah, thank you so
Congratulations
much.
on a fabulous book with so many fun layers in it and so many good twists. So, everyone, thank you for joining us today on Killer Women with Olivia Worley, and we will see you next time. Bye.